I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Guha Shankar, a cultural anthropologist. Guha is a member of the research programs team at the American Folklore Center, Library of Congress. Throughout his 3 decades in public sector work, he has been and continues to be dedicated to helping underrepresented communities and individuals document, preserve, and sustain their cultural traditions. In his presentation today, Guha will be surveying an initiative of the US National Library to collaborate with the Native American community and developers of cutting-edge digital technology to address critical issues in cultural representation, co-curation, intellectual access, knowledge repatriation, and preservation. And having recently myself just heard a presentation from the curator of a new recently opened city museum up here in Scotland, in Perth, talking about their work connecting their collections to their communities or external communities, the successes of that and also some of the challenges, I'm very much looking forward to hearing Guha's presentation. So Guha, over to you. Thank you.
I'm deeply grateful to Christina Composiore, Melanie Chung, Jeremy Upton, and all the RLUK personnel for the opportunity to share the work of the American Folklife Center and colleagues with you today. So I am, as Jeremy said, Guha Shankar, and I remain for the moment a staff member of the American Folklife Center, a custodial and research unit of the Library of Congress, a federal public cultural agency, and the National Library of the United States. In keeping with the subject of this presentation, which is about acknowledging, respecting, and being mindful of the cultural legacies of our Indigenous colleagues, mentors, and friends, I'll start with a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement recognizing Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land in which an event or gathering is situated, emphasizing their ongoing historical contemporary relationship with and presence in the territory, and acknowledging the historical displacement and impacts of colonization on these communities. Accordingly, the U.S. National Library, located near the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, is built on land that is part of the homelands of the Anacostan, Piscataway, Conoy, Pamunkey, and Manawa people. Indigenous peoples, including members of these nations, still live and practice their teachings and culture here today. The library honors these stewards of the land and all the Indigenous people of the United States, who are the first peoples, including those in the region where the library now provides its services. We at the library work to interact with these groups in a responsible and respectful way. To add to this official acknowledgement, allow me to express my gratitude to a central figure in the presentation and the project that we have undertaken, that being Donald Soktoma, Elder and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Passamaquoddy Indian Nation of Maine. Donald has encouraged me over the years to share the words and feelings of himself and his fellow citizens with you regarding the digital preservation, access, and repatriation project entitled Ancestral Voices. The impetus for the Ancestral Voices project dates to the period between 2012 and 2013. Working under a directive of the late James Billington, then the Librarian of Congress, AFC staff and the library's National Audiovisual Conservation Center began discussing how and in what ways the latest digital audio technologies could be used in fulfilling the National Library's aspirations to make our collections useful and available to the American public, and particularly to the source communities, which are Indigenous Native North American nations. Along with library colleagues Judith Gray, head of reference here at the center, and Jean Deanna, the now retired head of the Recorded Sound Division of the library, we helped drafted the project charter. Our fundamental aims were to use emerging digital technologies to preserve unique but fragile historical audio recordings, employ innovative approaches to repatriate cultural assets, and enable Native people to establish control over them as interpreters and curators of their historical materials, and to do so in a collaborative fashion. To a large extent, the Ancestral Voices initiative drew upon the accomplishments and processes of a previous effort the center initiated and carried out in the mid-1970s called the Federal Cylinder Project. The Federal Cylinder Project transferred thousands of wax cylinder audio recordings containing Native American content to reel-to-reel and cassette tapes, produced catalog records about the material with the input of Native scholars and community members, and then returned the tapes to the community of origins. As you see here on the screen, Dennis Hastings, Omaha tribal historian, and Dorothy Sarah Lee of the Federal Cylinder Project staff were among the chief architects of the project for the Omaha. However, in the present moment, it was obvious that a very different sort of effort was needed to achieve similar goals, particularly given that we're in the digital age. From the outset, it was clear to us and the project staff that the library's aims and scope in this initiative required external partners who could work with the collection's custodians at the American Folklife Centers and to contribute their unique experiences with digital technology of the kind that enables communities to manage and curate the collections that we at the library wanted to return to them. I'll mention two of the three partners that came together to advance the initiative, Ancestral Voices Initiative. One such partner is Local Context, and you see them on the far left. Local Context is a digital platform that seeks to address the needs of Indigenous and local organizations who want a practical method to deal with the range of intellectual property issues that arise in relation to managing cultural heritage materials. Local Context developed the traditional knowledge TK and biocultural BC labels to offer Indigenous communities a tool to add cultural and historical context and cultural authority to heritage content in their own local digital heritage archives, as well as in digital archives, libraries, museums, and other digital repositories globally. The labels, developed by Jane Anderson, professor of anthropology at New York University, grew out of her work with Kim Kristen, professor of anthropology at Washington State University, who developed the Mukurtu content management system, you see a logo there on the far right, to assist Indigenous communities in curating collections of their cultural heritage. The Mukurtu content management system was developed by Dr. Christian during the period of her fieldwork in Australia with the Warramungu Aboriginal community. As the Mukurtu website notes, the word itself in Warramungu means dilly bag. In Warramungu culture, dilly bags hold sacred items and are accessible by acting responsibly within the community and gaining the permission of knowledgeable community leaders. Like the dilly bag, then, the archive becomes a safekeeping place, a community repository for cultural materials and knowledge that grows from continued use, dialogue, and negotiations. Now, and returning to Ancestral Voices, in mentioning unique but fragile recordings, I refer to the library's collections of wax cylinder recordings, of which there are thousands in the LC holdings. For those of you who are not entirely familiar with the technical aspects of the thing, a wax cylinder is an analog sound recording format that consists of a mechanical grooved cylinder made of soft wax. Sound is recorded via a device that inscribes grooves into the material via stylus. And there were a number of manufacturers of such technology during this brief span of its commercial life, which lasted from the 1880s to the 1920s. I will refrain from dwelling too much on the technical aspects of cylinder recordings, except to note that as a preservation concern, cylinders are subject to all sorts of environmental and structural degradation and damage, not to mention the obsolescence of the recording and playback technology. These factors make recovery of the content a preservation, I say the word advisedly, nightmare, and foregrounds the imperative to recover content immediately wherever such recordings are housed. Technical preservation for us of the fragile carriers was linked once again, as with the Federal Cylinder Project, to the repatriation of the recordings to the communities of origin. During the heyday of field recording expeditions at the turn of the 19th century and continuing into the 1920s and on, the compact portable cylinder recorder was a technology that quite neatly served the interests of white ethnological field workers. Figures such as Alice Fletcher, Paul Radin, Francis Densmore, whom you see here on the right, and Jesse Walter Fuchs, whom you see on the left, ventured with these machines to many native North American communities to document their music, songs, and languages. The convergence of documentation technology and colonized people as objects of scientific research is a rich topic that has been covered by many scholars. I refer, for instance, to Erica Brady, a former colleague of mine, and her publication, A Spiral Way, How the Phonograph Changed Ethnography. Once the field recordings were made, they were deposited in archives, museums, and other cultural institutions far removed from the communities of origin, such as the library. And the songs and narratives of Native Americans recorded for white interlocutors were never again heard in those spaces, or at least not for decades. From the outset, then, the Ancestral Voices Initiative aimed to repatriate the recordings we preserved via digitization to the contemporary descendants of the original performers of the music and narratives. We envisioned this as an effort to reverse the colonial legacy of subjugation and dispossession of Native people from their own cultural history. We further linked the repatriation effort to establishing Native communities as curatorial authorities over their documentary heritage. From the perspective of a collecting institution, the objective was to have Native people author the cultural and historical context for the narratives and songs, and provide the insider meanings of those performances that they deemed appropriate for public access in the library's catalog records and the online environment. This meant that community members would be responsible in the main for translating the audio recordings, providing culturally informed descriptions and metadata, and deciding which songs and stories the Library of Congress would make available to the public. So here's a brief timeline of what happened in the period between 1890 and 1983 that I've just presented to you. And I use that just as background before moving on to talk about Ancestral Voices and the way in which we launched the initiative. We did so with the digital preservation of 31 cylinder recordings of the Passamaquoddy Indian community that were made by the anthropologist Jesse Walter Fuchs in spring 1890 in Calais, Maine. Calais is located in the northeastern region of the United States, bordering Canada. Fuchs went to Calais principally to test and familiarize himself with the capabilities of the cylinder phonograph recorder invented by Thomas Alva Edison. In this slide, the photo of Fuchs and a cylinder machine is shown alongside a sketch that hangs at the Wabanaki Cultural Center in Maine, depicting Fuchs and the Passamaquoddy knowledge keepers who shared their cultural traditions with him. The performers whom he recorded were Peter Selmore, Newell Joseph, and Peter LeCoute. Keen eyes will realize that the sketch is a reproduction of the photograph of Fuchs from a prior image. The Passamaquoddy material Fuchs documented in 1890 are unique in the annals of recorded sound history in that they contain the earliest known recordings of Native American song and narrative, along with narratives about historical figures and epic heroes, and also vocabulary and number lists. In the late 1970s, the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, which had held the cylinders in its custody for over 80 years, deposited the collection of the library for preservation copying onto reel-to-reel tape for the seminal Federal Cylinder Project, which I mentioned earlier. Subsequently, David Francis, Sr., a Passamaquoddy cultural specialist, and the tribe's linguist listened to the tapes diligently and transcribed what information he could glean from the low-fidelity recordings. The information he did gather was tantalizing, but the audio quality was of limited value due to the technical limitations of both the playback device and the analog preservation tape format, which we transferred the materials to. Francis's research notes were then incorporated into the collection information for the Fuchs recording of the printed multi-volume Federal Cylinder Project catalogs. The catalogs provide similar descriptive information for the thousands of other cylinders in the collection. And if you will see on the screen, you will see one page of the collection from the Passamaquoddy community on the right-hand side. And this is volume 232, and it's noted as the J. Walter Fuchs collection. This was the scantiest of information that was available at the time as to what the material and the content of the songs were. So when Ancestral Voices was inaugurated as a digitization, preservation, and return initiative at the library some 40 years after the Cylinder Project was completed, we had reestablished a relationship and developed a collaborative agreement with the Passamaquoddy community. That is to say, 3 partners, now we're 4. And we worked with the Passamaquoddy to pilot the project with the historical recordings made by Fuchs. We were confident that the preservation digitization would be a major advance over the analog preservation initiative we undertook in the 1980s. In 2015 and 2016, audio engineers at the library's National Audiovisual Conservation Center began digitizing the cylinders, employing cutting-edge digital tools such as the Archiphone, which you see on the left, to capture sound directly from the cylinders and transfer them into the digital domain. Subsequently, colleagues like Brian Cornell use a suite of cutting-edge digital software processes to restore and enhance content to a level of fidelity not previously attainable in the analog domain. And the process, as you see here, is via the Archiphone, a stylus-based instrument designed to extract sound from the 125-year-old cylinders. The recordings were sonically enhanced to yield cleaner and less noisy audio files. These recordings have been instrumental in enabling Passamaquoddy community members to uncover and comprehend language and other characteristics in the recordings that they had not previously been able to hear. I spoke to Donald Soktoma, the tribal elder and historic preservation officer, a few months after we provided the community with the digital recordings, and asked him what was different about these as opposed to the ones he had heard some 30 years earlier. Excuse me. He surprised me by saying he could make out the French inflections in the speech of his ancestors, and the community had been able to understand older words and phrases they had learned from the recordings and then incorporate them into their vocabulary lists. Such was the quality of the audio enhancements. Copies of both the enhanced and restored preservation master files and access files were then presented to the community for use. On the library's website, which you can now access, patrons and visitors can play back all three versions to compare audio quality between the digital preservation master files, the preservation tapes, and then the sonically enhanced audio. To assist the community library in developing the co-curation aspect of the project, the partnership included, as I mentioned, the traditional knowledge attribution labels developed by Jane Anderson. This is a way for Passamaquoddy and other indigenous communities to claim ownership of their cultural heritage in the LC web portals and the Passamaquoddy's own digital environment. The Passamaquoddy decided which labels, which you see here on the screen, and the attributions they wish to add to the online record. So if you see on the right-hand side, a little circle, these were 3 labels which the Passamaquoddy chose out of the 16 or so that are developed by local context to attach to each catalog record in the online environment. And as you can see, there are attributions, which is say how it is done. Outreach is intended to say that this is used for educational purposes. And there's an injunction against using it for commercial purposes by external audiences. There's also rights advisory in which the Passamaquoddy have elaborated on what those particular cultural labels mean, those icons mean. And again, you will notice here that the rights to the materials are held by the Harvard Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. And access to the recordings, as it says, may also be restricted. To that end, the Folklife Reading Room presents yet another way for protecting these materials from wider circulation without the consent of the Passamaquoddy. The Passamaquoddy community also entered into a collaboration with the Mukurtu Content Management System to develop a portal that was based in the community, outside of the library's domain. The Mukurtu Content Management System provides a Passamaquoddy, as with other indigenous groups, a means to exercise control over the management and representation of cultural heritage items they wish to make available for the benefit of community members, including the Library of Congress historical recordings. I'm going to take you through some features of the Mukurtu Content Management System and the way in which the information that the Passamaquoddy have entered into their own content management system is transported over to the Library of Congress materials. As you can see, the Passamaquoddy war song or trading song now has been, the Passamaquoddy have attached a note in the language field that is in Passamaquoddy. There's a summary field, which again is authored by the community. And what the other thing here that you also want to note is that the contributor names is that Peter Selmore is identified in the online environment as sort of a co-creator of the materials along with Jesse Walter Fuchs. Contrast that with the original catalog record and the contemporary one, and you'll see it's a rather striking one. The other feature that I'll point out here is that the online environment, both at Passamaquoddy, with the Passamaquoddy cultural content management system and here at the library, contains elaborate, culturally informed knowledge about what these materials and what these songs mean. These were done with careful and deliberate process of listening sessions in the community. Jane Anderson was present for a lot of them. Elders who were able to understand the language. Passamaquoddy language is on the decline due to a lack of younger speakers. But all of these sort of efforts have led to a rich body of material, which we now see in the online environment at the Library of Congress. So all in all, this deliberative decades-long process of building relationships, sustaining the collaborative process, employing technological innovations, the complex curatorial work has had effects. Most importantly, the work results in establishing Passamaquoddy people as central actors in the process of producing and controlling the representation of the community and their place to themselves and to the world at large. The work continues. In 2018, the Passamaquoddy launched a new website for cultural heritage items, as I said, deploying an instance of Mukurtu CMS in collaboration with Washington State University and local contexts. The site continues to be developed, and we anticipate that once the Passamaquoddy listening sessions are back in full swing, they had to take a hiatus due to COVID and the passing of certain language keepers. We anticipate that more such material and more such content and more informed cultural descriptions will come our way.
Okay, this next song here is a war song, which is was very difficult to be able to decipher, but with the quality devices that were used and all the sophisticated instruments that we used, we were able to break it down. So for those that are involved in that particular process, you made my job a little easier. So I want to thank you so much for doing that, because it was really difficult. I'm just going to briefly read it for you so you kind of can hear the language, and then I'll kind of sort of hum it a little bit so you kind of get an understanding of and see how it goes. Dama kujusik nida ba sisal Juna dabi wijinu once no o wazisuk matachwi wisanaksiu up wijinu de ha nida basis o nilna dabi wijinu nida basis o madachu wisi naksu up wiji nu de ha nida basis wiji nu nida basiso gil you najib han nagak najib hin dama kuchusi nida basiso juna dama dabi wiji nu nida basis nu Kujusi nida basiso junanda biwijinu once was his mother datri wisinaxil upji wijinu de basis nilnanda biwijinu nida basis maden daji wijinu datri wisinaxil damagujusi basis dama wijinu once no dama wijinu nida basis Tahu.
Well, you might not believe this, but that's the first time that's been sung in public in 128 years. It's the war song by Peter LeCoux. The Mukatu site is one way. We put this all together onto a Mukatu site, and Jane's going to talk about that, and Kim's going to talk about that later. But for us, it gives us a little bit of control on our cultural films, music, books, and the tribe's able to have a little bit of control on our stuff that we've never had before. And that's pretty powerful on itself. Everybody else has had control over our songs, over our stories. This puts it back onto us. And to me, that's the way it should be. Because our ancestors shared the stories. They didn't give the stories to anybody, but they shared them. And then for the tribe, there's a tribe in Canada, it's one of our neighbors. They shared the stories with a writer in the mid-1800s. And this writer said, I'm just going to document this, and I'm going to return this back to the tribe. Well, before he completed, he passed on, and his family got a hold of the stories. And the family told the tribe that they have the copyright. Those are their stories. Mm. And they would be threatened to go to court because those were the writer's stories, copyrighted. So the tribe was in the turmoil. You know, these are us. How can anyone claim these stories? So we're learning a lot through this whole process, especially with expertise that helps us understand. Personally, I know what right, you know, if my ancestors' story, my ancestors' song belongs to the Passamaquoddy tribe.
Thank you, Guha. Absolutely fascinating to hear about your project and what you've been able to achieve through that. So colleagues online, please do get your questions in. I have one or two lined up, but it'd be much better if we could get your engagement with this session. So please do give some thought about any questions which you'd like to pose, and make sure that you put those into the Q&A session. That'll be really helpful. So Guha, just to get started, I know you said that the project in effect built on some previous work in terms of connections, but just on that general question about establishing connections to a community, are there any particular aspects of that which you found perhaps a little bit more difficult, had to do a little bit more work? Could you reflect on that side of it?
I don't know that difficulty is not necessarily what I would say. Or maybe, I mean, no, you're right. It is difficult. It's difficult because of distance. You know, we're far removed in time and space in Washington, D.C. from communities. There are several that are here in the eastern part of the United States, such as the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot, with both of whom we've established relationships. Traveling is a bit of a problem. Getting out to communities is not part of the regular sort of workflow here at the library. I and colleagues have made the effort to meet communities where they are when we travel, say, for conferences or other trips, and sort of join up with them, join the two together and make visits to site visits to communities. What I think is much more difficult in this case, and I'll refer back again to the Ancestral Voices project, the digital era holds lots of promises, not the least of which, as you've seen, is that it enables representation to make its way into public view and into hearing in a very facile way. It is the case, however, that not all communities are so equipped as the Passamaquoddy were and other communities are to make the kind of effort at curating their cultural heritage collections. So the notion of infrastructure and the digital divide looms large in all of our conversations. That's one of the first things I always ask when we get approached by Indigenous colleagues or any community is where are you going to put the materials that are going to be returned to you? how will you safeguard and keep them? And I don't say this as if you don't have this infrastructure in place, you're not going to get it. It's more like, do you understand the ramifications of the work that's going to happen and the enormous lift that it takes? And we also have to understand that resources in cultural communities, not just infrastructure, is scarce and often absent. Trained personnel to take care of the materials in the digital age is also a fraught question. So all of these impinge, I think, upon the ability of Native communities to curate their own materials. Now, that is not to say that we don't return on a regular basis copies of recordings to to Native communities that ask for them. We're here as custodians. We're not here as gatekeepers. We safeguard the materials for further use. And we're excited, thrilled beyond belief when our materials make their way back into circulation and are used and adapted again in the contemporary period. So those are, I think, some of the difficulties. I mean, I can talk a bit more, but I'll stop there with those sort of major factors, if that's useful.
That's great. I can see a couple of questions coming in, but I think just to follow up on that one point about the digital side, and it's great that obviously digital gives lots of opportunities, both in terms of access and what we can deliver. I think you touched on briefly about the skills, were there any kind of particular skills gaps or any kind of barriers which had to be overcome in terms of digital skills or ability to allow the community to fully engage and get the most out of this?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, again, in terms of infrastructure and capacity, the lack of, say, people who are facile with digital technology, which managing cultural assets, that's certainly one factor, and that's not to gainsay the fact that increasingly there's a whole cadre of trained library and archival staff across Indian country, as we say, who have been taking on the task of getting training, getting library science degrees, and managing their community cultural heritage. But that's not uniform for the over 100 nations or so whose materials we have in our collections. Many communities still rely on rather arcane methods of having their cultural materials. I've returned digital hard drives to communities 15 years ago, only to find that they were no longer usable because nobody was able to actually access them and put them in a safekeeping environment. So we had to go back and not re-digitize, but copy the materials and provide them back to communities again. I think the digital technology introduces many challenges, and I mean, here at the library, and as your constituents and your colleagues are well aware, it poses enormous problems even for the most well-funded and well-resourced organization. Those are, I think, real. They're real consequences to entering into the digital realm. And Native communities, unfortunately, in some cases, bear the brunt of trying to figure it from the ground up without a whole lot of help. The thing which I think helps in the particular projects that I've been working with is the presence of people like the Mukherjee Content Management System out of Washington State University and Local Context, both of which have rather robust and helpful staff on hand to help Native communities manage their cultural materials. That is not available to everybody, unfortunately, only to those projects which make use of those particular systems and tools.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think particularly the content management systems jumped out at me as a really great use of technology, which fits in with the context of what you're trying to do. So we do now have some questions from the audience. So thank you for those. Please keep them coming in. So the first one I don't think will surprise you is we have a question around about copyright. So thanks for the presentation. Can you explain a bit further about the copyright issue and preventing the work being used without permission?
The library does not. The library doesn't exercise copyright over the materials that originate from Native communities. What we have are use rights to the materials. If we were ever to place any materials into public circulation, let me back up for just a second. Say you will notice exactly two instances in which native collections are made publicly available. That's the Omaha project, which I mentioned earlier that we undertook in the 1970s, 1980s. We did that in full view of the community. We did that with the imprimatur of the community in order to make those materials available online. We did not ask for copyright over those materials. We just said, would you be willing to use the digital platform at the time in order to place your materials online? So copyright is not necessarily the factor here. How we prevent them from being used, that's an entirely different question. In the digital domain, once something's online, any 7-year-old with the right kind of tools can copy any digital file that's online. That's just the fact of the matter. So we try to exercise due diligence, but we also make it very clear, and I think Native communities are very clear that the materials that they're going to put up online are something that they wish to share and wouldn't necessarily find it remiss if those materials were copied by other communities. The traditional knowledge labels are not a legal injunction. They are kind of an ethical ethical sort of marking of the materials to say, please be sure that you understand the ramifications of what you're doing when you're copying these materials. Again, it's not to say that bad actors or people of bad faith can't make use of those materials in any way, shape, or form that they see fit. And this was a concern that Donald Soktoma expressed to me more than once when he said, how do we prevent people from copying our materials? And eventually he came around to the conclusion that the only way to do that was to be very careful in putting up materials which the community had deemed were okay to be heard in public view. And if somebody used them, then that was just something that they were going to have to live with.
Which is interesting because it leads into really the next question, a couple of questions around about that kind of topic. So the next one we have is about, have you had cases of material which the Passamaquoddy did not want to be made available, which I guess had been recorded? And did that generate any kind of tension? Was that in terms of discussion about that?
I'm sorry,
So I didn't put it very well. I think it's more about if you had historic recordings and then when they had the opportunity to review them again, they decided that they weren't things they wanted to be put up.
Yeah, no, there of the 31 wax cylinder recordings that we have that are extant, the Passamaquoddy have been very careful in curating the materials that they want to see online. They have definitely held back materials from public circulation and public hearing because they were not comfortable with the materials, with the esoteric nature of the recordings. We have not heard from them that, people have, to the earlier point that I made, we have not heard of any unauthorized or unwanted use of the materials that are presently online, either from our end at the library or from the Passamaquoddy's side. So it may be and it's certainly the case that other institutions have definitely had these kinds of issues with people pulling down materials and making use of them for commercial purposes. I will note that the library at one point on an American Memory site back in the early days, about 20, 30 years ago, definitely had a problem with people taking recordings which are in the public domain or publicly available and people downloading them and then making CDs out of them and selling them. So that's just it's difficult to police it. We certainly try. Our legal department makes every effort to issue takedown notices, but it's a vast and thorny problem, which I don't think I'm not sure who is capable of actually enforcing those kinds of injunctions.
It's tricky. Again, a question related to the same kind of space. So it starts off, thank you for an inspiring example of good practice. Have there been instances of publicly accessible materials being labeled by Native American communities as sacred or culturally sensitive and then having to be withdrawn? And do you have a formal withdrawal process in place to deal with these kind of situations?
We do indeed have a formal withdrawal process to withdraw materials. It starts with an inquiry from the community to say, hey, we've noticed that on your site you have put up these materials, and would you take them down? That does not happen at the center necessarily because, again, as I said, we're very careful about the co-curation aspect of it, and we're always downstream of what the community wishes to be made publicly available. I will note, however, for instance, that colleagues at another cultural institution, I won't name names, put up historical recordings of Aboriginal communities that were made on a commercially available records that were produced back in the 1950s. The community had not known that the record, which was an analog, really an LP, which was an analog form, had been digitized. They didn't know the existence of those, and they contained sacred and esoteric materials, and much less. And then they hadn't realized, and they didn't realize until they saw it online, that the materials had been put up in all good faith, because the institution was all about trying to get the traditional cultural expressions out into public view, and they thought they were doing a good thing. I will say that that is not the approach that we would take. We would never put up materials unless they had been vetted by the community of origin. We certainly have inquiries all the time. Say, for instance, the Prints and Photographs Division has begun exercising greater control over images that are in their collection. By and large, I won't say definitively, and don't quote me on this, but they have taken down a large number of materials that were previously publicly available because they just want to preclude any of these sorts of tensions and any sort of finger pointing that maybe the library is not acting in the best interests of Native people.
Okay, thank you. Again, it's another good example of that change in approach and giving that opportunity for communities to have that greater control over materials. One question I had, and partly because my background is in the area of music, I was interested in the restoration process you did to the recordings in terms of the new digital presentation. There's often quite a bit of debate about restoration of sound. Was that also something which you spoke to the community about in terms of how you're going to restore the original cylinders? I just wondered, is there any controversy in there, or whether it was quite straightforward?
It was straightforward because it was a known commodity, right? I mean, we had undertaken this project back in the 70s with the explicit aim of returning materials on obsolete carriers back to communities of origin. So when in the 1970s, when the Federal Cylinder Project was initiated, Alan Jabbour, who was then director, convened Native scholars, community members to say, is this a good thing? He got the buy-in, if you will, from Native community members themselves to do this digitization. So we undertook it as a preservation issue to ensure that community cultural memory was not going to be lost forever. Which is not to say that certain community members have absolutely said, maybe those materials, if they were recorded without the knowledge or without the informed consent of the people and the performers who were doing that, then they should not exist at all. So that was a question which loomed large. We did not have that kind of pushback from the communities when we were transferring the cylinders to reel tapes. So in the case of the Passamaquoddy, it was already a known commodity. And what they wanted was better quality recordings because they were really frustrated with the quality of the recordings. While they could get some information, as I mentioned, David Francis did enormous work in carefully listening very patiently through layers of staticky sounds and crackles and pops from the original cylinder recordings. And I alluded to this, and I mentioned this earlier, when I talked to Donald Soktoma, he said, I'm amazed that I can hear the French inflection in the new recordings. And I puzzled over that for a while, and then, more fool me, I realized that the reason those French inflections in the speech of, people from 125 years ago was that because that part of Maine borders Canada, and French were colonizers before English-speaking Americans and English were. So the fact that he was able to discern that, was rather startling to me. The other thing which then also happened was that when we digitized the recordings and cleaned them up and made them and enhanced them sonically, Peter Lecoute, as one of the people who was recorded, all of a sudden emerged into public view. It was mentioned in Jesse Walter Fuchs's notes, but not necessarily in the recording, the catalogs themselves, right? When David Francis listened to them, but the accretions, over the years, the noise, when we cleaned that up, a third voice besides Peter Selmore and Newell Joseph was found by one of our catalogers. And so that was another revelation for them, because this was yet another ancestor who had been lost in the midst of time, but here was his voice, speaking voice. So there were all of these, sort of layers of discovery by the part of the Passamaquoddy, all of which was a direct result of the cleanup work that we did. So the Passamaquoddy, at least, are quite happy with the results, uh, and and like I said, they have been most receptive to like doing work, because what it does is it helps them, reintroduce vocabulary, language, and songs back into the community. And one of the examples that I had intended to show, except for the fact that bandwidth technology is not our friend, obviously, um, and I will make this recording available. But if you can actually go to the Library of Congress website and the launch of the Ancestral Voices platform, Dwayne Toma, who's one of the younger speakers in the community, sang a song which hadn't been heard in the community in 125 years since the time of the recording. He had learned the song from the digitized recordings and put it back into cultural, in sort of in a public practice. And that to me was one of those moments which just sort of raise a hair on the back of your neck and make all of the work that we do really worthwhile, just that particular moment.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I've got a question here about the original historic recordings. So the person's asking, do we know what motivated settlers to start these projects of phonographic recording? And do we know how the indigenous participants like Peter Selmore perceived these researchers and their own role in the research?
Yeah, this is a long and complicated question, and it goes back to the very the earliest anthropological ethos, which was motivated by documenting the vanishing Indian, right? This is the trope which has sort of plagued Native communities, because it's always, oh goodness, uh-oh.
Yes, we can still.
Am I there? Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you and see you. Don't panic.
Sorry, I did. The screen went blank. This is what motivated ethnologists like Densmore and other people, some of whom were more sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans, was they were part of the colonial enterprise of documenting subject populations. They were there to, capture indigenous and primitive lifeways. They thought these were the oral languages which informed all other sort of cultural expressions. They were there to document, as I said, the vanishing Indian. And the vanishing Indian is a trope which sort of carefully, very deliberately obscures the fact that the Indian was vanishing not for reasons of their own doing, but because they had been systematically eradicated from public view by colonial settler occupation, processes of subjugation and domination. So there were all these sort of scientific reasons, and I use the word scientific in diacritics at this point, because Native people are always the objects and not the sort of co-equals in the documentary process. And so that I think was the motivation. What people like Peter Selmore thought of Jesse Walter Fuchs is an interesting question. I mean, Fuchs says that they readily participated in the recording process, which, however, obscures the power dimensions, the power differential between, say, Fuchs, the white anthropologist, his Native interlocutor in the community, who was the Indian agent, who had essentially been sort of funding or providing funds to the community in times of duress. So there was an imperative, I think, on the part of the performers to perform for Fuchs. Fuchs did come back to the community, according, if we look at that photograph that I showed you earlier, in order to play back the recordings for the community. But if you read his journals, which are in the National Anthropological Archives, and even his published articles in the Journal of American Folklore, he's very clear that these are all vestiges of a past, of a rich and storied past, and nobody's going to keep up with them. And the Passamaquoddy will, sort of decline and fall into oblivion. Whether that was communicated to Peter Selmore is not known, but certainly Selmore and other Native interlocutors were keenly aware of their sort of place in the colonial order of things. And no matter how sympathetic people like Fuchs or Densmore were, in contrast to others, it's still the case that they were part of the dominant white power structure that went into communities and extracted knowledge from Native people.
Thank you. And I think that, what you were saying there was touching on a little bit of what we were talking about before we started the session today, and that crossover with some of the thinking going on about how researchers work with data and research communities, and particularly the work of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and their care principles that I think has very, very strong echoes of what those principles are trying to make sure does not happen going forward. And I know you said there's been a degree of crossover with that. So,
Yeah, there is, and while we work in parallel with with our colleagues at the Global Digital Alliance, also local context, which is now international and has been working with Maori communities in order to for them to enable them to claim cultural ownership over their intellectual property. And we are in receipt of that. I mean, we also occupy an interesting position in that we are an instrument or an arm of the federal public sector. So we have to be minding our P's and Q's, if you will. And I will say no more on that topic other than to say that there are certain restrictions on how far down this particular path we can go in terms of digital return and whatever. We have not been stopped in our work so far, and I assume we will continue to work for the betterment of our native colleagues and interlocutors. But,
okay,
we'll see.
great. Thank you. Colleagues, I can see I don't have any other questions at the moment, but you've got about a minute or two if you have something, a burning question you want to ask. But I think just a final one for me, perhaps, Guha. Obviously, fantastic to hear about the work which you've done. What about your future plans? Are you able to say a little bit about what you might hope to do next?
What are our future plans? So future plans are to wait on our colleagues in Indian country to approach us to say we would like to do a similar project or something similar to what's been done already. One of the things that we continue to work to do is to return as much material, digitized copies, and whether they ever make it into public circulation or not is not. And I don't know how else to phrase this. It's not our concern. What we're concerned about is that the community has the materials in their hands to do what they wish with them. If they wish to join the library and work with the library in order to surface these materials and make them available in public view, then we're all for it. Until that time, we will continue to provide advice. I continue to provide training at venues like the Association for Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums to provide cultural documentary training in terms of librarianship, ethnographic research, interviewing. In other words, to put tools and methods and means back into the hands of Native communities so they can undertake the projects that they wish to undertake, so that we're not the ones who are always sort of leading the show. We've also recently provided grants in the amount of $50,000 or so to several indigenous communities, so that they can be the curators, the documentarians, the creators of their own cultural heritage materials. All of those materials will come back into the library. We'll have 3 such collections going up online over the next a year or so. The Huma community of Louisiana is one. The Comanche community of Oklahoma is another. There's a native Hawaiian community that will also have all of their, who have all gone through the training that we provided them to, establish best practices and documentation. We work with them extensively to create metadata records and to author culturally informed descriptions. So that's yet another way that we're trying to get around to doing the work that we know how to do. And I must say that these are all fresh collections. These are all new collections, not the historical legacy collections, which have a different valence and a different set of problematics, if you will.
Yeah.
I see another question here in the chat.
Yes, that's this one. So yes, we do have one, and I think we have time for one last one. So we're back to the copyright issue. So what do you think about institutions applying Creative Commons non-commercial, non-derivative licenses to digitized online materials authored by former colonized peoples? You might need a moment to think.
I'm not, if I understand looking at the question one way, Creative Commons licenses are fine and good. I mean, in point of fact, the traditional knowledge labels are modeled to a certain extent on that, but the licenses to online materials, I would ask the question, did the descendants of those formerly colonized people authorize the institution to apply those licenses? or was it something that the institution said, well, we're just going to do it because it's a good thing? And I think there's a tension between the one and the other in that particular instance. We do apply Creative Commons licenses to public domain materials at the library, but these are materials from the 1900s, and none of them are indigenous materials. A lot of them were created by federal cultural agencies, so in effect, they were made for for public distribution and consumption. And that's how we see it as a legal sort of way of getting materials into circulation for the benefit of the broader American and global audiences. I would say that when you use the word colonized, you're entering a very fraught realm, and all care must be taken to make sure that the wishes of descendants and contemporary people are taken into account before you enter into any of those kinds of agreements or arrangements.